Now, one of the things then that this brings up is the question of when we are to submit and when we are not to submit to authority that God has placed over us. Notice here that the faithful action required disobedience to authority. It required disobedience to authority. Now, Pharaoh was the rightful authority over the people of God at this time from a civil perspective. He was owed a submission. And yet here in this particular situation, we have a situation where disobedience was required, that it would have been a sign of lack of faith to obey the king with regard to this particular command. Now, getting right where this line is very important, because one of the most common sins today is rebellion against lawful authority. So in today's world, the tendency is to fall off the edge far on the side of rebelling against all authority and not respecting authority. We see this with children, with their parents. We see this with students, with teachers. We see this particularly with the police. As we saw all of the rioting that went on a couple years ago, all of it because related to a lack of respect for lawful authority. So I'm very much aware that the tendency for sin is on the side of disobeying authority. And yet, it is important still to note that there are times when obedience to lawful authority is in fact a sin. And so we need to be very clear about where the line is. And if you were to ask, okay, where is the line? Where is my obedience to authority required and where is disobedience required? The answer is, quite simply, obedience is required to lawful authority all the way up until the point where the lawful authority requires you to sin. And the reason for this is because God himself is the one who is the highest authority. And so what we are to remember is that God is the one who gives his law. And even if you were to ask, what's the main reason why I must be subject to a lawful authority? So whether it be a child submitting to his parents, whether it be a citizen submitting to his government, what's the main reason? The answer is because God has commanded it in the fifth commandment. God has commanded it, therefore you must submit. But God has also commanded the civil authority to govern according to his revealed will with regard to the commandments of God as he has given them. And so therefore, when a lawful authority transgresses God's commandment and requires sin of those who are legitimately under them, then it is actually the duty of those who are under that authority to disobey. And we see a great example of this with Peter and John when they were taken before the Sanhedrin. And they say, judge yourselves whether it is right for us to obey you rather than God. And this is basically the great statement that shows where the line is. If you can say to those who are above you, in whatever context it is, you judge for yourself whether it is right for me to obey you rather than God, where there is an actual juxtaposition, you are asking me to do something that is contrary to what God requires of me to do, then disobedience is required for faith. The answer basically to the question that Peter and John ask is this: it is not right for us to obey you rather than God. We see something of this even in the passage that we read earlier with 1 Samuel chapter 12. The problem that they had was that they wanted a king to replace God. That they wanted, and this Samuel makes this very clear when he says, you asked for a king when God was your king. God was your king. A king like all the other nations, they believed their king was basically God. And so the people wanted this kind of king to the exclusion of God being their king. And Samuel reminds them, no, you got your king, but you have to be obedient to God. And God's blessing or curse is not going to be dependent upon whether or not you obey your king. It's going to be dependent upon whether or not you obey God, who requires obedience to your king. That much is still true. But yet it's still obedience to God. Obedience to God that is the true measure of faithfulness. And so disobedience here was required. It was not optional. It can be easy to justify submission to ungodly authorities who require sin by saying that there is in fact a submission that's due. This can be an easy trap that we can fall into on the other end, where we can say, well, look, God's required of me that I submit to this authority, and therefore I'm going to submit. And you can convince yourself that you are following God when you are in fact disobeying him. Here what's happening is that the parents of Moses do not fear the king. They fear God. They disobey the king because it is not right for a king to command the death of the children of his own citizens.